Hey everyone, this is Mathmetrics, and today I'm going to be talking about how voice handling is done in Bitwig 3.0. They've reworked it extensively, pretty much, compared to 2.5.1, and they iterated on a few different approaches during the betas for 3.0, but this is how it's settled out. This is probably what we'll be using for a while into the future. It's a pretty comprehensive set of voice management options. And they can be a little confusing when you find and look at these and even hover over the tooltips. In some ways, they may or may not be very clear to you. For example, what's the difference between true mono and Didja Mono? The tooltips help, the description in the doc helps a little bit, but it still can be a little confusing. Like, what's the real difference? So I'm going to help clear up some of that confusion. And I'm going to explain some other things that are a little confusing, like retrigger makes it sound like it would apply to everything, no matter what. But in fact, these are only legato retrigger options. They only take effect when you play legato notes. And the steal options likewise have a similar kind of confusion because this fade time isn't strictly related to voice stealing. It kind of applies to just the oldest voice in general, but it's also a threshold for when stealing behavior happens. So I'm going to go over all that and make it clear. The one thing I'm not going to talk about in this video is voice stacking and how we do unison by stacked voices. I'm going to save that for a second video because it's a kind of a long subject in itself. So let's get right into it. The first thing to understand about voicing and voice management is you're not going to find the voicing behavior on your channel, your track inspector options, because of course it's specific to any one instrument like phase 4 or polysynth or polygrid, right? And where you find these voice parameters is on the instrument itself. So you have to click the header for the instrument to find the voice handling options. Both of these boxes apply to voice handling, but there's a couple other places that some additional voice handling options happen. Like, once upon a time you used to set certain behaviors of glide mode up here, but now all the characteristics about glide are found in the instrument itself in the glide knob for the instrument. And every instrument has a glide knob, and it has this little L button that you can activate by clicking it, and this affects your glide behavior. So briefly, if you set a glide amount and you play 2 disconnected notes, they're going to have glide behavior. But if you trigger the legato button, then the glide behavior only happens when you play legato notes, but it won't happen when you play disconnected notes. So here's disconnected notes. And you can hear there's no glide, but if I hold the first note down and trill the second note in a legato manner, then we have glide. Okay, so glide's the easy one. Get that out of the way first. And it's helpful to note that the glide knob is found in different places in every synth, like in polysynth, it's hiding right here, but it's the same basic, knob with a legato button. In phase 4, the glide button is up here with the legato button and so on. So it's consistent now across all instruments, and that's really nice. That's where you find legato stuff. Now, getting to the voices themselves and how that works. The first confusion is going to be between the 2 different mono modes versus poly mode. And you set poly mode by grabbing this mono box and dragging upward to set the number of voices you want, right? And voice stacking is a different parameter. Voice stacking can happen whether you're in mono or in poly, right? We'll talk about voice stacking again in another video after this one. So let's just focus on true mono versus Didja Mono and what's the essential difference between them. The basic idea is true mono is meant to emulate other hardware synths or modular racks, hardware modules, probably some other software modular environments like Reactor, VCV, and so on. And it all revolves around the behavior of envelopes. And by envelopes, I mean every envelope in an instrument. most of the instruments have at least two envelopes. Here's an amplitude envelope for polysynth. Here's a filter envelope for polysynth. And you can't see a graphic visual representation like in the grid. But, you know, if one of these envelopes is really long with long attacks and long release times and the other one's really short, it's always the longest envelope that wins when it comes to the way voice management behaves. It's always affected by the longest envelope in the instrument. And I can demonstrate that in a second. Back to polygrid. First, let's see what true mono does and sounds and looks like. And the grid is great because it shows these little white dots for your voices that actually show where that voice is in its phase on the envelope. So we have a kind of moderately short attack and a long release. And you can see the single white dot for the single voice that's being played in true mono. If I go to polyphonic mode for a second and we give ourselves three voices and I play three different notes to create three voices in succession. Well, okay, I have such a short attack. Let's make a longer attack so you can see it. There's our three voices. They're all going to cluster up at the top together, and if I let go of one note and another, you can see them all decaying at separate rates because they were let go at different times. So this is a great way to understand the mono and poly modes. So true mono emulates certain types of synthesizers and modules by maintaining a constant amplitude or value between the release phase and the attack phase of the envelope. So if I play a single note and then let go and re-trigger, you can see that wherever I re-trigger, it's always going straight across horizontally from the exact amplitude value of the release, and when I re-trigger, it just goes straight across to the same exact same amplitude value and continues back up its attack phase. Let's shorten this up a little bit so it's a little more obvious what's happening. Okay, so that's true mono and what it's doing. Now, Didja Mono is different in that it always re-triggers from the beginning of the envelope each and every time. No matter where it is in the release phase, no matter how high the amplitude is, it's always going to jump to the smallest amplitude at first and re-trigger the envelope. If we make this envelope a little longer, you can hear it. And again, if we go to true mono and play the same thing, so the first takeaway, the thing to understand is if you want a really defined attack, like a noticeable attack when you're playing monophonic notes in quick succession, you're probably going to want Didja Mono and then adjust your attack to get the feel and the bounce and the shape you want. So here's a typical riff. That's in true mono. Now Didja Mono. Let's speed up the attack just a little bit, but give it some bounce. All right, back to true mono. Okay, big difference. So if you want more articulation, Didja Mono, adjust your attack and release to get that feel you want, that bounce and articulation you want. Now under the covers, the way that they're doing this, and especially the way they're doing Didja Mono so that it doesn't pop and crackle with sudden amplitude jumps. Like if I trigger this all the way to the top and let go and re-trigger quickly, and again, let me slow it down so it's really apparent. So it's loud, and then it goes really quiet and starts from the beginning of the envelope, but you're not hearing any pops or clicks. No pops, no clicks. How are they doing that? Well, the way that they're pulling that off is Didja Mono actually spawns a second voice temporarily. When you retrigger, it's a new voice, a second voice, and that voice is lasting for 10 milliseconds by default. And it's crossfading as it fades out, it's crossfading with the new voice. So you get this very smooth transition. It's like putting on smoothing on an LFO envelope. So that's how they make Didja Mono have this nice articulated behavior, but be smooth without pops and clicks. And this is where we get into, I'm going to briefly jump over here to this fade time. It says steal fade time, and if you understand voice stealing, which I'll talk about in a minute, you would think that this applies only to stolen voices, but it doesn't. This is really probably more accurately described as oldest voice fade time. And we can see this behavior in Didja Mono, because remember I said it spawns two voices to pull off its magic of no clicks and pops. This value is expressed in milliseconds, and you can go up to a maximum of 1,000, which is 1 full second. And if I play 2 mono notes and retrigger the second note in less than a second, well, if I just retrigger a second note, you're going to see that they overlap. You're going to see 2 dots here, and you're going to see the number 2 briefly appear here for about a second. One note's going down while the attack of the other one is going up, but we're in a mono mode, right? And yet we're seeing 2 notes. There we're playing an interval. Here we'll play a bigger interval. There's actually 2 voices alive and overlapping every time I retrigger, and they're overlapping for a full second. And you can see it reflected here, you can see it reflected here. So the point is, Didja Mono can be made to kind of be at least a pseudo polyphonic kind of sound. You can have 2 voices alive overlapping each other for as much as a full second. And you won't notice it at the default value of 10, but you'll definitely notice it if you kick this fade time up. So this isn't strictly a steal fade time, at least not the way we might conceptually think of it. It's more an oldest voice fade time. The first voice you trigger, when you finally re-trigger a second voice in this mono mode, the first original voice will still persist for a full second if this fade value is up high enough. So it's not strictly related to voice stealing, because voice stealing is more about stealing the same key. And I guess on a bigger level, the reason they named it this way is because kind of under the covers, it is stealing back that second voice after this length of time. Like it spawns a second voice to pull off its magic of no clicks and no pops, but having a nice fully articulated envelope. But it wants to steal that voice back to be reused again after a certain amount of time, even though it's not necessarily tied to whether or not the same exact note is being played. So, take it for what it's worth. I personally think it's more helpful to think of this as the oldest voice fade time. Okay, so let's talk about poly mode for a second. Let's set ourselves up with 2 voices and see what happens now. The first thing to notice, I'm just going to play 1 voice disconnected over and over. Now, I'm allowed to have 2 voices, and even though it's the same note, those 2 notes are overlapping, and you can see where they are in the attack and release. And the most important thing I want you to notice that the newest note being triggered every time is always starting from the beginning of the envelope. If I make this envelope a little longer, it'll be perhaps more apparent. Okay, so poly effectively works like Didja Mono. It's spawning a second new voice, the old voice is still going, and because you're not suddenly changing amplitude massively from high to low within the same single voice that's alive, you don't get clicks and pops. So that's why poly mode will always have this same kind of articulation if you want, some articulated sounds. And you can't really get that constant rising sound that you got out of true mono that I demoed a little bit earlier. Okay, so the next thing about the active voices and the number of voices is that depending on this oldest voice fade time, again, you will get different behavior. Let's see if I can show this. If we do 3 voices, you can see that that third voice, that third note in the chord stack, effectively stole, even though we don't have any kind of steal setting here, it's always stealing that first or oldest voice after this amount of fade time. See how that third note instantly cuts off the lowest first note? I'll hold them a little longer. I've got 2 voices. As soon as I hit the third note, the oldest, lowest voice goes away. Okay. So that's how this works when you have a small number of voices. You briefly saw a 3 flash here. If I speed up, if I slow down this fade time, let's make it a half a second long. You're going to see a 3 linger here, and you're going to see a third voice kind of linger, even though I only have a maximum of 2 voices. And if I play them disconnected and don't hold them, you can see briefly 3 voices exist. Now this gets more apparent when we go up to like a large amount of voices. And we're going to put this back down at its default of a very short 10 millisecond oldest voice fade time or steal fade time. We'll play a single note. Slow down the attack a little bit. You can see up to 9 dots being created and 9 active voices up here. It's just that same note stacking on top of itself, overlapping. If I play different voices, we have 5 voices active. And if I do a pedal tone where I keep bouncing on that first note, it's going to multiply every time I do it. And there's basically 3 copies of this lowest note in that stack. Now, voice stealing basically says, if you play the same note, the same key, steal the original voice, steal the voice back, which is useful for pedal tones. That's usually what you want this for, is a riff that has a pedal note in it, like so. There's only 1 copy of this lowest note when this steal same key is on. Listen to the difference when I turn this off. See how that first lowest note is stacking up and building up in intensity because there's 3 or 4 copies of it being spawned? Okay, so that's what steal same key is kind of supposed to manage, is pedal tones. That's the main reason you'd use that. Might be other reasons, but that's the main one I would reach for steal same key. Now, it gets a little interesting too if you have 9 voices and you play a single note. See, we got up to like 7 copies of that. Now if I turn on steal same key, now it sounds monophonic. The 2 top notes, they're decaying, they're going through their full release phase, but the first note keeps getting re-triggered. And again, if we turn stealing off, all 3 of those notes seem to successively get louder because multiple copies of each note is getting stacked. Okay, so that's key stealing. Now, What affects the stealing behavior is this is not only the time that it takes for the oldest note to fully decay and die off, the oldest voice, but this is also the threshold for the stealing behavior. So again, here's a single note with no stealing. Here's the single note with stealing. But now what happens if we put this fade time way up? Let's put it up to a full second. Single note. We're in key stealing mode now. They're stacking up. And why are they stacking up? Because as long as new notes are being re-triggered, the oldest notes will last for a full 1,000 milliseconds before they're finally stolen back. So 1,000 milliseconds is like somewhere around the midpoint. If I let the release go far enough down and re-trigger the next note with steal key on, and I make sure that the release lasts for longer than 1 full second, 1,000 milliseconds, then it will steal the key back and re-trigger, and you'll see the old note will disappear. You can see how they all sort of disintegrate by a certain point down here on the release because, well, it's probably better if I make it 2 voices. Maybe we'll see it better this way. See if I slow down my timing and trigger each new note at longer than 1 second each, we're only ever going to have 2 dots alive or 2 voices alive on the envelope. Okay, now the last thing I want to show you about envelopes is that it's always the longest envelope in the instrument that wins and controls the voice handling and voice stealing and so on. So if we take this envelope and we duplicate it, same exact shape, same exact size, let's disconnect that. And we're going to put a filter here. Actually, we're not going to manually connect it. I'll keep it disconnected, and we're going to use the modulator here to modulate the filter. Okay, give it a nice long filter movement. And I'm not going to filter the sound because it'll just muddy things up. So let's shorten the attack and release of the amplitude envelope, but let's make a nice long attack and release for the filter. So when I hold down a note, and let's go back into mono mode for a second. True mono is fine. Actually, let's do Didja Mono. So this should be re-triggering every envelope, all envelopes in the instrument from the beginning of their envelope. And then if I let go, and it doesn't matter where it is, if I re-trigger, both of those always start from the beginning. If I flip to true mono mode, each one of them will just, wherever the amplitude is at on the release, it will just go straight across horizontally to the attack. And the main thing I want you to note here is that as long as this longer envelope is alive, the voice is still being used. So Didja Mono, when there's no envelope active, we have 0 voices being used. But if I press a key, now we're using 1 voice. And if I let go, it's going to wait until the longest envelope fully decays before it releases that voice. Same is true for 2 notes. Right? If we go to polyphonic mode, and we'll set it for 2 voices. Even though this thing's releasing those notes, they don't fully release until this envelope also gets to the end. And then you see the white dots disappear here too. So effectively, just remember, if you have a bunch of different envelopes in your grid build, it's always the longest one that affects the number of voices, and all the other behaviors I showed you about voices are affected by how long and how many notes are being kept alive by the longest envelope in the instrument. Okay, now let's talk about retrigger. These are legato retrigger options, and they only take effect when you play legato. Here we're in Didja Mono, and you can hear it retriggering from the beginning as I press each new note. Let's make the release a little longer so it's more obvious that it's retriggering. All right. If we set it to always retrigger in legato mode, and I play two different notes, I'm going to hold down the first note and keep holding it while I trill a second note on and off. That's a legato trill. And you can see that with the note on and the note off of the second note, it's always retriggering. That's what always does, is it will retrigger all the envelopes, whether you're doing note on or note off. And only legato, if I play these disconnected, it's not going to do that. All right, now note on retrigger says only retrigger the envelope during note on events. So if I do that same legato trill, it'll only retrigger when I press down on the second note, not when I let go. Down, up, on, off, on, off. Okay, for that second note. And then never just says don't ever retrigger. Let's slow this down. Okay. In true mono, these work too, but they're a little different because true mono is never actually retriggering from the beginning. It's harder to distinguish anything. Here's the legato never. And if you watch really close, you can kind of see the little white dot jitter just a little bit as I go up and down, because it's temporarily, when I let go of that second note, it's releasing and then instantly retriggering at the same level. So it makes this tiny, almost imperceptible jitter or jumpiness. Okay, so it is actually, well, let's go to always and look at it this way. Right, the jitter's there, it's just not doing anything different. There's no perceptible difference between these retrigger options when you're in true mono. So I guess the easiest way to think of it is retrigger mostly only applies when you're in Didja Mono. That's when you're going to hear it. And then never retrigger. All right, so that's pretty much it for the voice handling things here. Now, there is one other thing to understand, and it only applies to the grid. In all other instruments like polysynth and so on, it's only the envelopes that control how long voices last. But in polygrid, there's a few other options for controlling how long any voice is kept alive. And you can see it on certain modules like any envelope module. If you click it and look in the internal inspector, you'll see this affect voice lifetime. And what we're saying here is in the grid, if we want to, we can make this not keep voices alive, right? And we can make this not really affect polyphonic stuff so much. Let's go up to 9 here, and let's press a couple keys. Let's speed up the attack a little bit. Okay, I'm pressing a note, but nothing's happening at all, because we basically said the envelope has nothing to do with voices. This envelope has nothing to do with voices. But let's say I make a second envelope. Let's just duplicate this again. And in this envelope, here, I turn this on. So here, affect voice lifetime is off. Here, it's on. And now, if I press notes, because this envelope, even though it's not hooked up to the actual signal, it's controlling whether or not voices are even spawned and exist in the first place, okay? So that's the first thing, is you can do some tricky things here by having some envelopes that don't affect when your voices are spawned or killed off or stolen, right? And having only maybe one envelope or whatever actually affect when and how voices are spawned and when they're stolen back or faded out. The other thing that can affect voice lifetime is on the audio output. There's another affect voice lifetime button. And this time, but it's off by default, because normally by default, it's the envelopes that control voices, just like in other Bitwig instruments. But over here in the audio, we could say, let's let the audio signal control how long voices last. Let's go over here to both of these filters and disable them so they're no longer affecting the voice lifetime. And if we come and play this single note now, right, we're still getting those voices, those multiple voices, because we're polyphonic and they're all staying alive, but they're staying alive not because of the envelope anymore. They're staying alive because of this. And I can demonstrate that by making these envelopes much, much shorter. But I'm going to come here and set it so that the threshold for killing off a voice is either negative 96 decibels or 50 milliseconds. I'm going to crank this number way up. What's the highest I can make it? 1 full second. Let's see. Because that's a short envelope, it still is affecting the number of voices. Let's see. Right. Okay, so these envelopes are short. You're only hearing one voice, and you're only seeing, because it's so short, only one note being triggered here. But look over at this value as I play several notes in a row, right up here. Okay, as many as 4 voices are being created because I'm basically triggering about 4 voices every second. If I turn this value back to its default and we let the threshold of the sound determine how long the voices last, and I crank out these releases so that the threshold, at least one of the releases, so that the threshold of the amplitude stays high for a long time. We're up to 9 voices here, and they're all staying alive, but it's not the envelope that's controlling that. Now, if I come over here to this threshold and I drag it way up and make it so that as soon as it falls below like 18 dB, it kills off a voice. Watch what happens even though I have a super long release here. Actually, I need a lower threshold. Let's make it more like 90. Okay, now you can see it's killing off the older voice faster, and we're only getting a maximum of 3 voices. And it's even that very last voice, you can hear it cutting off abruptly. You don't even hear the real envelope fade because it's cutting it off as soon as it drops below 9 dB. Let's make this even more extreme, like 4 dB or 3 dB. Right? So as long as their amplitude is staying above negative 5 dB, the voice stays alive. But as soon as the amplitude drops below that, and it's not being controlled by the envelope, it's being controlled by this setting. So you have options. And there's one other module, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's in the user guide where they talk about how voice handling in the grid is a little different. There's one other module that you also can use to affect the voice lifetime. So thanks for hanging with me. That's pretty much everything about voice handling except for stacking. I'll cover that in the next video, and I'll see you soon. Thank you.